And the Ukraine aid effort moving forward. You've talked before about the need for Ukraine aid. They will soon reach a point where they can no longer defend themselves against Russia without additional aid. Are you worried the longer this takes, with the Republican House in the House now crafting their own bill, the more at risk you're putting Ukraine and the more you're empowering Vladimir Putin?
I think, if we were interested in helping Ukraine, we would have done it at the beginning of the war instead of waiting for so long. Yes, that has to be a concern. But our main concern right now is making sure that we're crafting a good bill, a solid bill, a bill that's not going to put us any further into debt, and a bill that is prioritizing what's the important thing to most Americans right now, which is the border. So we want to make sure that whatever we are doing, we're making, it's not just making Ukraine safe, but we have to have America safe. And when we look at the disaster that has happened in the last 3 years at our border, we have got to prioritize that. We're hearing that from Americans all across the country.
I want to ask you about the border piece in just a moment, but specifically on Ukraine. How worried are you, again, that the longer this takes, the more at risk Ukraine is?
And again, we would like to be able to move faster. I think there's questions that a number of Republicans have asked, including what the strategy looks like, what the timeline, what is the commitment, what does winning look like. I think those are still decisions that are being made, and we're still negotiating. So again, and we would like to go faster, but until those questions are answered, I think you want to make sure that you have a thoughtful bill, and that you're just not rushing on because we're putting into a time frame of being between a rock and a hard place.
You mentioned wanting to see those border provisions in another bill as well. I should note that the Senate did pass a bipartisan bill that had border provisions in it before Senate Republicans backed away from that, and then just a Ukraine and foreign aid bill moved through the Senate. But you're from Texas. You know the challenges at the border. Part of this global migration trend we're seeing in the U.S. too. When it comes to solving the border crisis, though, Congresswoman, why vote to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary rather than back a bipartisan bill that actually had some very conservative immigration reforms in it?
So I want to be clear, the Senate did not pass that bill. That bill never came out of the Senate to go to the House. So
the border bill did not, correct. It was just foreign aid that came out.
Yes, correct. So we never saw a Senate bill. We saw some text of what was being decided at the Senate side, but it never came over to the House. The House did send over a very strong bill in H.R. 2 that had the provisions that codified what the Trump administration had put in place, specifically the Remain in Mexico policy. It was ending catch and release. It was fortifying the relationships between Immigration and Customs Enforcement and local law enforcement and state law enforcement.
If I may, Congresswoman, as you know, the Senate did not take that bill up.
Correct. And that's what I'm saying. You asked what the House is doing to be able to look at border, what has to happen. And I think what has to happen is that bill needs to be taken up. H.R. 2 needs to be taken up. I think if the Democrats in the Senate were serious about border security, they would look at the provisions that were in that bill. They would recognize that this is not just a thoughtful bill, but this is a bill that is based on solutions that had worked in the past. The part of the Senate bill that we really did not think was it was going to be dead on arrival was the allowance of 5,000 to 8,500 people, illegal immigrants coming into our country a day. Under the Biden administration,
Congresswoman, if I may, actually, the automatic trigger to shut down the border was when it actually reached the threshold of 5,000 a day as a day.
Actually, the 5,000, that's not accurate. It was 5,000 on average for a 7-day period, for a week period, but it was 8,500 in one single day. So if you do the math, that's nearly 2 million people coming over a year.
Well, those numbers, some recently we've been seeing those numbers. The border would have been shut down had that kind of automatic trigger been in place.
So had they been looking at H.R. 2, what we saw under H.R. 2 when those policies were in place was less than 1,000 people coming in our border every day, as opposed to 5,000. If they just were to take the policies that the Biden administration from day one took off the table, we could already have had a secure border, and we would not see the ridiculous record numbers of people coming into our border every day in what we've seen since the Biden administration took over. But you asked the question about Mayorkas and why it was necessary to impeach him. American people want to make sure that we are holding these folks accountable. When you have seen 10 million, actually I learned today from Chad Wolf that over 11 million people have come into our country illegally in the last 3 years. When you look at the deaths as a result of fentanyl coming in, over 110,000 dead Americans, 5 dead Texans every single day as a result of this coming over our border, we have got to get serious about border security and about...
Congresswoman, if I may, I'm sorry, I apologize for the interruption. I'm not sure about the 11 million number or the source for that. That's not what we've seen lining up with Border Patrol patrol numbers, and also, as I'm sure you've noted before and seen before.
Yeah, we had a briefing. Yeah, we had a briefing today with Chad Wolf, and that was the number that he had quoted.
Fentanyl largely comes in through legal ports of entry, and the majority of it is brought in by American citizens, not
we say that because that's what we're catching. We're catching the drugs that are coming over through legal through our ports of entry. But the fact is we have absolutely no idea how much of that drug is coming through illegally that we don't catch. And I think it's a huge leap of assumption that we're saying, oh no, it's only being brought in by Americans and it's only being brought in at ports of entry.
Well, these are U.S. government and Border Patrol numbers, figures, and characterizations.
Yeah, but that's absolutely, it's only catching what's coming through those ports of entry. It's
which is the vast majority of the fentanyl coming into the country right now.
But that's the problem, is you don't know. You don't know. We're assuming that of the getaways, that are coming through, they're not being caught. So the answer is we really have no idea how much it's coming in that we're not even seeing.
Congresswoman, can I ask you, immigration has obviously become a leading campaign concern and an issue for former President Donald Trump, but we know that he didn't want Republicans to back any kind of deal and not to give President Biden a so-called win. Is it fair to say that Donald Trump is calling the shots on what Republicans in Congress will or won't do right now?
Not that I'm aware of. I never got a phone call from the president asking me not to support a bill. I think what we want is our borders secure. What we saw from the bill that was coming out of the Senate is it was going to normalize the record rates of people coming over. It was going to further incentivize people coming over by giving them work permits. It would not have secured our border. It would not have prevented illegal immigration. It would only have made the problem worse.
Republican Congresswoman Beth Van Duyne from Texas joining us tonight. Congresswoman, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Former Indonesian General Prabowo Subianto declared himself the winner of Indonesia's presidential election today. Though the final vote count is still pending, exit polling showed he had a huge lead. He addressed cheering supporters after the polls closed.
Even though we are grateful, we must not be arrogant. We must not be arrogant. We must not be euphoric. We still have to be humble. This victory must be a victory for all Indonesian people.
Prabowo now serves as defense minister under the outgoing president, Joko Widodo. During the country's authoritarian regime, Prabowo was accused of major human rights abuses, including overseeing the abduction of democracy activists, accusations that led to a U.S. travel ban. Indonesia is now the world's third largest democracy. It's a majority Muslim nation spread out across 3,500 miles and 17,000 islands. It sits at a crucial pivot point between China and the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific region. For more on the significance of this moment, we turn to Ben Bland, director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. That's a think tank based in the UK. Thank you for being with us. So Prabowo Subianto, as we mentioned, a former Army general linked to human rights abuses. He won with the hugely popular current president's son running as his vice president. Tell us more about these men and what their elections suggest about Indonesia's future.
Well, it's a remarkable result, really, for someone with a checkered track record, as you rightly highlighted, but someone who's shown remarkable persistence. So after he was dismissed from the military in 1998, Prabowo entered the kind of new democratic politics in post-reform Indonesia. And he tried multiple times to get the presidency, including two really bitterly fought contests against the current president, Jokowi, as he's known, which Prabowo lost. And then Jokowi appointed him his defense minister to sort of bring him into the tent, as it were. And that eventually led to this unofficial alliance where Jokowi's son became Prabowo's VP candidate. And Prabowo has really ridden on the back of Jokowi's incredible popularity to finally make it, it seems, into the presidential palace. And I think the appeal was in part his own kind of strongman, tough guy image, but that wasn't enough. It was really the implicit backing of Jokowi, whose economic reforms, his economic growth that he's achieved in Indonesia has made him really, really popular, with approval ratings of something like 80% at the end of his second term, which is something that most US presidents would kill for.
And as I mentioned, their victory is raising questions about that country's commitment to democratic values. Indonesia is now the world's third largest democracy. and it's a democracy that was hard won after the Suharto regime. So what does their election suggest about democracy and human rights moving forward there?
Well, I think there were real concerns that under Jokowi, while his economic policies were quite popular, some of the checks and balances in Indonesia's democracy were eroded, and that's concerning. And when you kind of hand the levers of a system that's been weakened somewhat to a character like Prabowo, that understandably makes a lot of Indonesian human rights activists incredibly nervous. But I think the important thing to understand is, firstly, most of the Indonesians who voted for Prabowo did it because they want him to lead their democracy. They don't want him to dismantle it. And the second thing to understand, I think, is that while there are concerns about democratic erosion or backsliding, that's not unique to Indonesia. We've seen similar problems in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. And Indonesia still has a highly decentralized system. There still are a lot of channels for opposition in the parliament, through the media, through civil society. And democracy isn't just about elections, it's about what you do afterwards. So I think this battle for power and influence in Indonesia's system is going to continue, even if Prabowo is confirmed as the president. That's not the end of the story. I think there's a lot of fight to come. Plus, we have to acknowledge that Prabowo, does seem to suggest that he's a changed character. And ultimately, in the end, it was democracy that's allowed him, it seems, to get the top job.
In the minute we have left, Ben Bland, this is a region, of course, where the U.S. and China have been on a collision course over Taiwan and a host of other issues. What are the stakes here? What are the stakes for U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Indonesia is a really, really important non-aligned country, so it's never going to have an alliance with the United States, even though it has quite close military cooperation. It's also not going to be an ally of China, which doesn't have its own allies in any case. But it's a really influential country in terms of the security in the region, in terms of technology, the future of electric vehicles, a lot of key minerals are mined in Indonesia. So the decisions they work with, whether they use US technology or Chinese technology, are going to have a really big impact on this broader competition. Especially because Indonesians won't ally with either side. It's a really important country where all sides want to get more influence in different ways, and Indonesia wants to kind of fiercely defend its independence and try and play off the US and China against each other for its own sort of maximum economic benefits. But I think that's going to get harder and harder in a world where US increasingly intense, and there will be pressure on countries such as Indonesia to make many, many difficult choices.
Ben Bland, Director of the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House. Thanks for your time this evening.
Thanks.
As America braces for a rematch between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, the ages of both men are troubling voters in this election year. Laura Barone Lopez looks at the questions many have about aging, memory, and the presidency.
Amna, age is much more than just a number for both President Biden and former President Trump. It's a potential political liability. We're going to focus on some of the questions people have. But first, we're going to hear from some older Americans, voters who are 70 and above, to get their perspective on this moment and what amounts to an ongoing national conversation about age.
My name is Dan Cabrera. I live in Southern California, and I'm 71 years old. And neither candidate really is got it together, in my view. They both have serious shortcomings when it comes to their clarity, their intellect.
So I'm Dennis Taylor. I live in Helena, Montana, and I'm 77 years old. The whole thing that we're talking about in this election is a number between 77, that's my age, the same as Donald Trump, and 81. When Chuck Grassley was running for re-election at 90 for another 6-year term, which his voters overwhelmingly gave him, nobody said a word.
I'm Susan Ward. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and I'm 70 years old. I'm an active 70-year-old, and I wouldn't have the stamina to be president of the United States. And so I do think it's worth thinking about. At the same time, this is what we've got.
My name is Mary Alice Shaker. I live in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, and I'm 77 years old. I think President Biden is very competent and very, very knowledgeable. And if he gaffes a little bit once in a while, I don't think that affects his ability. For the next 4 years, I'm not so sure.
Nobody said anything about Warren Buffett or Cecily Tyson or Jane Fonda or Dr. Fauci or Mick Jagger or Harrison Ford. I mean, think of all the people who in their 80s and 90s contributed to the society. Can you imagine saying that Martin Scorsese needs to take a test before he can do his next movie?
You can look at other major world leaders, in my view, and Zelensky is a stellar example. Macron, Rishi from UK, etc. These guys are younger, more energetic, more able, in my view, than either of the two candidates we currently have as leading Republican Democratic presidential candidates.
I've seen some people list that medical, cognitive test kind of requirement. And on one hand, I could say, oh, that's probably a good idea, because then we'd have some more information about older people running for office. But on the other hand, I think to myself, do we do that just for presidents?
We worry about implicit bias where we may not know that we have certain biases against certain kinds of people or stereotypes or prejudice that we may have or harbor. In the case of ageism, it's like an explicit bias and everybody's cool with it.
I watched with interest the Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Dianne Feinstein, and if they had only retired when they were supposed to retire, a lot of the mess we're in right now wouldn't be there. You have to know when it's time. If I were in their shoes, I would step aside.
Oh,
I would step aside and let younger people take over.
it's up.
Following verbal stumbles on the campaign trail, polls have consistently shown voters are concerned about the mental fitness of both leading presidential contenders. In a recent poll, an NBC News survey found that 76% of voters had major concerns about President Biden's physical and mental health. Meanwhile, 48% of voters had the same major concerns about former President Trump. To help us understand more about what happens to our brains as we age, and for some